She offered the mistress a job as her assistant to document every lie. Catherine noticed something strange about Elena that night in the quiet Boston cafe. She kept looking toward the door, then back at the folder between them, as if she wasn't sure whether handing it over was a mistake. "If Bernard finds out I showed you this," Elena said quietly, "he'll know we've been comparing notes." Catherine didn't answer immediately. She opened the folder and studied the document. For months, she had tried to believe her husband's explanations, even when small details didn't quite fit. Then Elena pushed another paper across the table. Catherine looked down. Her own name was on it. She slowly looked back at Elena, and for the first time, Catherine wondered whether the affair was only the smallest part of what Bernard had been hiding. "Welcome to Daily Comfort Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment your time and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue sharing meaningful stories together." 2 weeks before Catherine sat across from Elena in that quiet Boston cafe, her life had looked ordinary enough that nobody would have thought to ask whether something was wrong. On most mornings, she woke before her alarm. At 6:10, the kitchen lights in their home came on, the coffee maker started humming, and Catherine would stand barefoot on the cool floor while checking her calendar on her phone. She liked knowing what the day would demand before the day had a chance to surprise her. It was one of the habits that had followed her from childhood. Catherine had grown up watching her parents solve problems without making a performance out of them. Her mother had worked for Boston Public Schools, and her father had spent most of his career maintaining commercial heating and cooling systems. Money had not always been comfortable in their home, but bills were paid, promises were kept, and problems were handled. Her father used to say, "If you can fix something, don't spend all day complaining about it." Catherine had taken that lesson seriously. By 32, she had built a career in corporate operations at a healthcare technology company in Boston. Her colleagues knew her as the woman who noticed the missing number in a spreadsheet, caught scheduling conflicts before they became disasters, and remembered conversations other people had forgotten. She was not loud. She didn't need to be. When Catherine spoke in a meeting, people usually stopped looking at their laptops. Her life outside work was organized in much the same way. Mortgage payments were scheduled automatically. Important documents had their own folders. Receipts were kept longer than most people thought necessary. Even the pantry had a system. Bernard teased her about it. "You know, normal people just put things in drawers, right?" Catherine would look at him over her coffee. "Normal people lose things." "Exactly," Bernard would say, smiling. "That's why I married you." She would laugh. Those were the kinds of moments Catherine remembered later. Not the arguments, not the locked drawer, not the second phone, the ordinary mornings. Bernard was 38 and ran a growing business consulting firm that worked with small and mid-sized companies. He was white, polished, confident, and comfortable in rooms where people spoke casually about investments, contracts, attorneys, and expansion plans. Catherine had admired that about him when they first met. He seemed to know how to move through the world without constantly asking whether he belonged there. They had met through mutual professional friends and taken their time getting close. Their relationship had not begun with grand gestures. It grew through dinners after work, long conversations in parked cars, weekend errands, and the quiet discovery that they enjoyed being around each other. When they eventually married, neither of them expected their life to become extraordinary. They bought a home in Boston. They maintained their separate careers. They helped their parents when they could. They argued about ordinary things, whose turn it was to replace something around the house, whether they really needed another subscription, and why Bernard kept leaving his shoes beside the front door instead of putting them away. For several years, Catherine believed that was what a successful marriage looked like. Then Bernard started traveling more. At first, it made sense. His company was growing, and he had clients in other states. A 2-day trip became 3 days. 3 days became a week. Sometimes he came home exhausted and dropped his suitcase beside the bedroom door. Catherine never accused him of anything. She asked questions. Who was the trip for? Client meeting? How did it go? Fine, long. That was usually enough. Then one evening, While Bernard was getting ready for another trip, Catherine noticed a second phone on the dresser. She picked it up. "What's this?" Bernard glanced over. "Work phone. You didn't have one before." "I do now." He said it casually, as though the answer should have been obvious. Catherine handed it back. "Okay." Bernard smiled. "That's it. What do you want me to say?" "Nothing. I just thought you'd ask more questions." Catherine almost laughed. "I asked." He kissed her forehead and went back to packing. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A few weeks later, Bernard began keeping certain business documents in a locked drawer in his home office. When Catherine asked what they were, he told her they involved confidential client information. That was reasonable. The second phone was reasonable. The travel was reasonable. The locked drawer was reasonable. Even the late-night messages were reasonable. At least, each thing was reasonable by itself. That was what made it difficult. Sometimes, while they were watching television, Bernard's phone would light up on the arm of the sofa. 11:37 am. 12:16 am. 12:38 am. He would glance at the screen, turn the phone over, and continue watching. Catherine noticed. She always noticed, but she didn't ask. One night, Bernard saw her looking. "Client issue," he said. Catherine nodded. She understood business pressures. She understood that some clients were demanding. What she didn't understand was why she sometimes understood Bernard's explanations only halfway. And that bothered her more than she admitted. Catherine had spent her entire life believing that being competent meant being able to understand things. So when Bernard explained something using business terms she didn't fully follow, she sometimes nodded instead of saying, "Wait, explain that again." She told herself she would ask later. Later usually never came. And slowly, without realizing it, Catherine began confusing trust with silence. She believed a good wife shouldn't interrogate her husband over every unexplained detail. She believed she was being mature. She believed she was protecting their marriage. What she didn't realize was that she was also protecting herself from having to discover an answer she might not be ready to accept. For the moment, though, their marriage still looked fine. And Catherine was very good at making things look fine. The first time Catherine saw Elena's name, it was almost midnight. Bernard was asleep beside her. His breathing had settled into the slow, even rhythm Catherine had heard thousands of times before. Outside the bedroom window, rain tapped lightly against the glass, and the street below was nearly empty. Catherine had woken because she needed water. As she walked past Bernard's side of the bed, his second phone lit up. She stopped. The screen showed a message. "Elena, I don't understand why you're still asking me to wait." Catherine didn't touch the phone. She stood there for several seconds, staring at the name. Elena. There was no last name, no explanation, just those words. She went downstairs, drank her water, and returned to bed without waking Bernard. For the first time in months, she didn't sleep well. The following morning, Bernard behaved normally. He made coffee. He complained about traffic. He told Catherine he had a 9 o'clock meeting. Nothing about him looked different. That almost made it worse. Catherine went to work and tried to concentrate, but Elena's name stayed in the back of her mind. At lunch, she searched the name online. There were too many results. She didn't know the woman's last name, age, workplace, or anything else that would tell her which Elena was connected to Bernard. So, Catherine stopped. She didn't want to become the kind of person who searched through strangers' lives because her husband had received a message. But over the next few days, other details appeared. A restaurant receipt, a hotel charge, a message Bernard accidentally left visible on his phone. Then, one evening, Catherine saw a notification that included Elena's last name. That was enough. She searched again. Elena worked in administrative operations for a company in Boston. She was professionally ambitious and had recently been taking courses related to project management. Catherine found nothing scandalous about her. No social media behavior that suggested recklessness. No obvious attempt to display herself as someone's secret partner. Just a woman with a career, an apartment, and an ordinary-looking life. That surprised Catherine. She had never consciously imagined what the other woman would look like, but somewhere in her mind, she had pictured someone completely different from Elena. Someone careless, someone who enjoyed being involved with a married man, someone Catherine could easily hate. Instead, she found a woman who looked like someone she might have passed in an office hallway without noticing. That made the situation harder. Catherine eventually found enough evidence to confirm what she had been trying not to believe. Bernard was having an affair. And then, she discovered something else. Elena believed Bernard's marriage was essentially over. Bernard had told her that he and Catherine had been living more like business partners than husband and wife. He had said they were staying married because of complicated financial and business arrangements. He had told Elena that he was preparing to leave. He had given her enough details to make the story believable. Catherine sat alone at her kitchen table that Saturday morning, looking at the information she had collected. She could have confronted Bernard immediately. She could have woken him up and demanded an explanation. Instead, she kept thinking about one thing. If Bernard had lied to Elena about the marriage, what else had he lied about? That question changed the way Catherine looked at everything. The second phone no longer looked like a work phone. The travel schedule looked different. The locked drawer looked different. Even the late-night messages felt different. But Catherine still didn't call Bernard. She called Elena. The conversation was brief. "I think we need to meet," Catherine said. There was silence on the other end. "Who is this?" "My name is Catherine." Another silence. Elena knew immediately. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in Boston. Elena arrived first. She chose a table near the wall and kept her coat on even though the cafe was warm. When Catherine walked in, Elena stood. For a second, neither woman said anything. Elena looked younger than Catherine had expected, though not by much. She looked tired. Not guilty in the theatrical sense Catherine had imagined, just deeply uncomfortable. Catherine sat down. "I know about you and Bernard." Elena swallowed. "I didn't know he was still—" "I know what he told you." Elena stopped. That sentence changed everything. She slowly sat back down. "What exactly did he tell you?" Catherine looked at her. "That our marriage was basically finished." Elena's face tightened. "He said you were separated emotionally. We live in the same house." "I know. He comes home." "I know." Elena looked down. "I thought you were already done." Catherine nodded slowly. "I believe you." Elena looked up. "You believe me?" "I believe that's what he told you." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The cafe around them continued as normal. Cups clinked behind the counter. Someone laughed at another table. A barista called out a drink order. It felt strangely ordinary. Catherine finally asked, "How long?" Elena hesitated. "Almost a year." Catherine looked away. A year. She had been sleeping beside Bernard, while another woman had been waiting for him to leave her. That thought hurt. But something else hurt more. Elena began explaining. Bernard had told her their marriage was complicated. He had shown her messages about arguments. He had talked about lawyers. He had even sent her a photograph of himself sleeping in a hotel room after an argument with Catherine. Every piece had made his story more believable. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she asked a question Elena clearly wasn't expecting. "What does he tell you about his business?" Elena frowned. "My business?" "Bernard's." "He says it's doing well." Catherine leaned back. "He tells me the same thing." Elena looked at her. "What?" Catherine didn't answer immediately. She had spent months telling herself that her doubts were probably nothing. Now she was sitting across from the woman her husband had been sleeping with, and for the first time, the two of them were comparing pieces of the same puzzle. "I don't think we're dealing with just an affair," Catherine said. Elena stared at her. Neither woman knew yet how much that sentence would change their lives. Elena looked at Catherine as if she had just heard something she wasn't sure she understood. "You think there's something else?" Catherine folded her hands on the table. "I think there are things Bernard has told you that don't match what he's told me." Elena gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. "That doesn't necessarily mean there's some big scheme. He's probably just trying to keep everyone happy. Catherine looked at her. That's what I've been telling myself. There was no accusation in her voice. If anything, she sounded tired. Elena glanced toward the window. Rain had started again, leaving thin trails across the glass. So, what do you want from me? Catherine reached into her handbag. For a moment, Elena seemed to tense, as if she expected another photograph or some piece of evidence that would force her to defend herself. Instead, Catherine placed a simple folder on the table. I want to offer you a job. Elena stared at her. A job? Yes. With you? Temporarily. Elena actually laughed this time, not because anything was funny, because the alternative was not knowing how to respond. You're serious? I am. You found out your husband is sleeping with me, and your solution is to offer me employment? I didn't say it was a solution. Then what is it? Catherine looked directly at her. You know things about Bernard that I don't. Elena's expression changed. Catherine continued. And I know things about Bernard that you don't. The words settled between them. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Elena finally shook her head. This is strange. I know. You want me to work for you because I'm having an affair with your husband. No. Catherine paused. I want you to work for me because you've been close enough to Bernard to see parts of his life that I've never seen. Elena looked uncomfortable. What exactly would I be doing? Administrative support, scheduling, document organization, business follow-ups, nothing unusual. And Bernard? He doesn't need to know why I hired you. Elena stared at her. You want me to hide this from him? I want you to do your job. There was something about the calmness of Catherine's answer that made Elena stop smiling. Catherine opened the folder. I've been reviewing some things from our household and from the business information I've legitimately had access to. There are inconsistencies. What kind? Dates, expenses, explanations. Nothing I can prove is wrongdoing yet. Elena looked at the papers. And you want me to investigate him? Oh. Catherine's answer was immediate. I don't want you spying on him. I don't want passwords. I don't want private messages. I don't want you accessing anything you're not authorized to access. Elena looked relieved, but still suspicious. Then what do you want? Records. Catherine explained that if Elena encountered legitimate business information as part of her work, she would document it accurately. Dates, invoices, schedules, expenses, instructions, business communications, anything that contradicted something they had already been told. Nothing fabricated, nothing stolen, nothing obtained through deception. Elena listened carefully. And what happens if I find nothing? Then I find nothing. And if I find something? Then we verify it. Elena studied her. You really aren't trying to get revenge. Catherine's eyes lowered for a moment. I've thought about revenge. That honesty caught Elena off guard. But revenge won't tell me whether my husband has been lying about our finances. Elena looked at the folder again. What makes you think you can trust me? Catherine almost smiled. I don't. Elena raised her eyebrows. Then why hire me? Because I don't need to trust you completely to verify what you document. That answer stayed with Elena. She understood it. It was also uncomfortable. Catherine wasn't asking her to become a friend. She was asking her to help establish facts. Elena told her she needed time to think. Catherine gave her a week. The decision became harder than Elena expected. She had already begun questioning Bernard's promises. He had told her he was going to leave Catherine. He had told her his business was doing well. He had told her that his professional connections could help her move into project management. Now she had to consider the possibility that all three things were less certain than she had believed. She also needed money. The project management certification she wanted required tuition and examination fees. She had been saving slowly, and losing Bernard from her life would mean losing the professional opportunities he had promised. But Elena knew something else. If she accepted the job, she would have to confront the possibility that Bernard had not simply lied to Catherine. He may have been lying to her, too. A week later, Elena called. "I'll do it." Catherine didn't sound surprised. "Okay. But I want everything in writing." "You'll have it. And I don't want to be involved in anything illegal." "Neither do I. And if I think you're asking me to do something wrong, I'm leaving." Catherine nodded. "That's fair." Their first day working together felt awkward. There was no pretending they were friends. Catherine gave Elena a desk, a schedule, and a list of ordinary administrative responsibilities. The work itself was almost boring. That was intentional. Elena organized appointments, reviewed invoices, confirmed meeting times, and prepared documents for upcoming business discussions. Nothing dramatic happened, until she noticed a discrepancy in Bernard's schedule. Bernard had told Catherine he was traveling to meet a client in Connecticut on Thursday. But one of the legitimate scheduling records Elena handled showed the meeting had been moved to Friday. Elena mentioned it to Catherine. Catherine checked her own calendar. Thursday was the date Bernard had given her. Friday was the date on the business schedule. Neither woman knew what that meant yet. Catherine didn't accuse Bernard. She simply opened a notebook. For a moment, her pen hovered over the page. Then she wrote 4 words. "Ask him to show me." It was the first time Catherine had decided that an explanation alone would no longer be enough. The first few days of Catherine and Elena working together were uncomfortable in a way neither woman knew how to describe. They were polite. They were professional. They even laughed occasionally when something went wrong with a calendar or a printer, but neither forgot how they had met. Catherine was still married to Bernard. Elena was still the woman he had been seeing. That fact sat quietly between them, even when neither woman mentioned it. What changed was that they began noticing how often Bernard's stories depended on details nobody thought to compare. The first example was small. On Monday morning, Bernard told Catherine he had spent Sunday evening preparing for a meeting with a client in Providence. Later that morning, Elena was reviewing Bernard's schedule and found that the Providence meeting had not been scheduled until Tuesday afternoon. She showed Catherine. Catherine looked at the calendar for a long moment. Maybe he prepared Sunday and the meeting is Tuesday. "That could be it," Elena said. Catherine nodded. She wasn't interested in turning every inconsistency into evidence, so she wrote it down and moved on. The next one involved a business expense. Bernard had told Catherine that a hotel charge in Cambridge was connected to a late client meeting. Elena later saw the corresponding scheduling record. The meeting had ended earlier than Bernard had suggested. Again, it wasn't proof of anything. Maybe the client stayed late. Maybe Bernard had another meeting. Maybe the record simply didn't contain everything. Catherine kept reminding herself of that. 2 different explanations don't automatically mean one of them is a lie, she said. Elena nodded. "But if it keeps happening?" Catherine looked at her. "Then we pay attention." That became their rule. They wouldn't assume. They wouldn't accuse. They would pay attention. Over the next 2 weeks, small contradictions continued appearing. Bernard told Catherine he had met a potential investor at a Boston restaurant. Elena later saw an email confirming that the meeting had actually been with an existing client. Bernard told Elena he had been traveling because Catherine had been difficult at home, and he needed space. Catherine's calendar showed that she had been working late that same evening and had barely spoken to him. Bernard told Catherine he had cancelled a Friday meeting because the client had postponed it. Elena found an email indicating that Bernard had cancelled it himself. None of these things, individually, proved much. Together, they began to feel different. One afternoon, while they were sorting invoices, Elena finally said, "He does this with you too." Catherine looked up. "What?" "He changes the story depending on who he's talking to." Catherine leaned back in her chair. "You've noticed that?" "I thought I was imagining it." Catherine gave a quiet laugh. "Oh, did I?" There was another realization Elena had been slowly reaching. Bernard had described Catherine to her as controlling. He had said Catherine was emotionally distant, overly focused on work, and constantly trying to manage every part of his life. But working beside her made that description increasingly difficult to believe. Catherine didn't control Elena. She didn't even tell Elena how to dress, where to go, or what she was allowed to say. She gave instructions clearly, listened when Elena disagreed, and apologized when she made a mistake. One evening, Catherine ordered takeout for both of them because they were working late. She noticed Elena hadn't eaten much. "You don't like it?" "No, it's good." "Then eat." Elena smiled. "You're not very controlling." Catherine laughed. "That's disappointing. Bernard has given me a reputation." Elena looked down at her food. "He told me you were hard to live with." Catherine's smile disappeared. "What else?" "That you cared more about work than your marriage." Catherine was quiet. Then she said, "He told me you were impulsive." Elena looked up. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. There it was, the same pattern. Bernard had given each woman a version of the other that made it easier to distrust her. Elena shook her head slowly. "So he needed us to dislike each other?" "Maybe," Catherine said. "Why?" Catherine looked toward the office window. "I don't know yet." That answer mattered. She could have pretended she understood. She didn't. For once, Catherine was comfortable saying it. She didn't know yet. The following morning, she opened the notebook where she had started recording the inconsistencies. Instead of writing accusations, she created 2 columns. What Bernard said, what the records showed. She stared at the headings for a few seconds. Then she began filling them in. And for the first time, Catherine wasn't trying to prove that Bernard was lying. She was simply trying to understand how many different versions of his life he had been giving to the people around him. The first financial inconsistency came from an invoice Elena almost ignored. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she was going through a stack of documents Bernard had asked her to organize before an upcoming client meeting. Most of the paperwork was ordinary: vendor invoices, payment confirmations, contracts, and expense reports. Then she noticed a familiar company name. It belonged to one of Bernard's larger clients. The invoice showed that the client had reduced its monthly payment significantly. Elena looked at the document again. That didn't match what Bernard had told her. A few days earlier, Bernard had described the client as one of the company's strongest accounts. He had even told Elena that the relationship was likely to expand. She carried the invoice to Catherine. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine looked up from her laptop. "Sure." Elena placed the invoice on the desk. "Do you know this client?" "Yes." "What did Bernard tell you about them?" Catherine hesitated. "He said they're renewing." Elena turned the invoice toward her. "They've reduced the contract." Catherine read it carefully. The number was lower than she expected. "How long ago?" 3 months. Catherine leaned back. "Maybe this is a temporary adjustment." That could be it. Neither woman said anything else, but the same uncomfortable feeling returned. The problem was that Bernard had never described the company's financial situation as uncertain. He had described it as controlled. He had told Catherine they were being conservative because he was preparing for expansion. When she asked whether they should adjust some household spending because of the business, he had laughed. "We're fine." Now Elena was finding records that suggested the company was not quite as fine as Bernard had claimed. Over the next several days, more information appeared. Another client had reduced its contract. A major project had generated fewer payments than expected. A vendor had sent several reminders about an overdue balance. None of it meant the company was collapsing. Catherine was careful about that. Businesses had difficult months. Clients changed contracts. Payments were delayed. Projects failed. That was normal. What wasn't normal was how different the internal records looked from the picture Bernard had been giving them. One evening, Catherine and Elena sat at the dining table with several documents spread between them. Catherine rubbed her forehead. "Maybe I'm looking at this wrong." Elena looked up. "What do you mean?" "I understand operations. I understand budgets. I understand forecasting, but accounting isn't my specialty." "Oh. So maybe there are things here I'm not seeing." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to understand everything before you're allowed to ask a question." Catherine looked at her. The sentence was simple, but it hit somewhere deeper than Elena intended. Catherine had spent years avoiding that exact admission. At work, she could ask someone to explain a technical process because it was part of her job. At home, with Bernard, it felt different. He spoke confidently. He moved quickly through numbers. Whenever Catherine asked for clarification, he would sometimes smile and say, "I'll walk you through it when I have more time." And because she didn't want to appear incapable, she would say, "Okay." Now she looked at the documents again. I should have asked more questions. Elena didn't tell her she was right. She simply said, "Then ask them now." That was what Catherine did. The next morning, she asked Bernard for a basic explanation of the company's recent cash position. She kept her voice casual. Bernard was standing in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone while his coffee cooled beside him. "Why? I've been thinking about the business." "That's never a good sign." Catherine smiled faintly. "I just want to understand where things stand." Bernard put his phone down. "We're fine." "I know. I just want to understand the numbers." "There aren't really numbers to understand." Catherine looked at him. "What does that mean?" Bernard said. "Catherine, you're making this more complicated than it is." She said nothing. He continued, "Some clients are slow paying, that's all. Are any contracts being reduced?" "Not materially." She remembered the invoice. "What about the client in Cambridge?" Bernard's expression changed for less than a second. Then he recovered. "They're restructuring internally. Are they reducing the contract?" "For now." "So they are." "Catherine, a temporary reduction doesn't mean anything." She nodded. "Okay." Bernard picked up his phone again. "You worry too much." Catherine didn't respond. She walked away. Later that afternoon, she told Elena exactly what he had said. Elena looked at the records again. "That's not what these show." "No." "So either the records are wrong, or he's minimizing the situation." They continued reviewing only information they were legitimately able to access. The pattern became harder to dismiss. Several clients had reduced their commitments. The major expansion project Bernard had described as promising had performed poorly. Operating revenue was weaker than he had suggested. There were also transfers between business accounts that Elena couldn't immediately explain from the records available to her. Some had clear descriptions, others were vague. Catherine stared at one transfer for a long time. "What do you think this is?" "I don't know." Catherine nodded. That answer didn't frighten her anymore. Not knowing was no longer the problem. Pretending to know had been. She wrote the transaction down. Then she added another line beneath it. "Verify before assuming." Neither woman realized it yet, but the financial questions were about to lead them somewhere much more complicated than a struggling business. Because the next document Elena found wasn't simply about money moving through Bernard's company. It was connected to another company neither of them had heard Bernard mention. The name of the second company appeared on a payment record Elena was reviewing late one Thursday afternoon. At first, she assumed it was a vendor. The name meant nothing to her. It didn't resemble the name of Bernard's consulting firm, and there was no obvious indication of what the company actually did. She clicked through the business records available to her, through the work she had been assigned. There was very little information. A payment had been made from Bernard's main company to the unfamiliar entity. Then another, then another. Elena wrote the name on a sticky note and carried it to Catherine. "Have you heard of this company?" Catherine looked at the note. "No." "It's been receiving payments from Bernard's company." "How many?" "I've found several so far." Catherine took the note from her. "What are the payments for?" "That's the strange part. Some have descriptions, some don't." Catherine frowned. "Could it be a legitimate vendor?" "Possibly." "Then we don't assume otherwise." Elena nodded. That had become their pattern. They were learning to resist the temptation to fill gaps with the explanation they feared most. Catherine asked Elena to pull together only the information they were legitimately authorized to review. They looked at dates, payment descriptions, and corresponding business records. Some transactions made sense. A service fee, a professional expense, a business-related payment. but several others were difficult to connect to any obvious operating expense. Catherine leaned back in her chair. Maybe it's a holding company. Maybe. Or a subcontractor. Maybe. Elena smiled slightly. We're getting very good at saying maybe. Catherine smiled too. We're getting better at not pretending we know. That evening, Catherine brought the issue up with Bernard. They were eating dinner at home. Nothing about the evening looked unusual. Bernard was telling her about a client who had complained about a contract revision. Catherine listened while cutting vegetables on her plate. When there was a natural pause, she asked, "Have you ever used another company for consulting expenses?" Bernard looked up. "What do you mean?" "A company that handles some payments for your firm." He took a sip of water. "Several companies handle payments. Why?" "I saw a business name I didn't recognize." "Where?" Catherine paused. "In some records." Bernard's expression remained calm. "It could be one of our contractors." "What's the name?" Catherine told him. Bernard looked away for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Oh? That?" Catherine waited. "It's an entity we use for certain projects." "What kind of projects?" "Nothing you need to worry about." Catherine felt something tighten in her chest. She kept her voice even. "I wasn't worried. I was asking." Bernard smiled. "You don't need to understand every part of the business." There it was again. That familiar sentence. Catherine stared at him. For years, she had accepted it because she knew Bernard had areas of expertise she didn't. But this time, something inside her resisted. "Then explain this part." Bernard put his fork down. "Catherine, it's complicated." "That's okay. I'll explain it later." "When?" He looked at her. "When I have time." She nodded. "Okay." Bernard picked up his fork again. The conversation moved on. But Catherine couldn't. Later that night, she wrote down exactly what Bernard had said. Not what she thought he meant. Not what she suspected. His actual words. "It's an entity we use for certain projects. Nothing you need to worry about. I'll explain it later." She stared at the page. Then she closed the notebook. The next morning, Elena found another payment connected to the same company. This one was larger, much larger. She called Catherine into the office. "I think you should see this." Catherine stood beside her and looked at the screen. The payment had been made only days after Bernard had transferred money into another business account. The transaction itself wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but the timing made it worth understanding. Catherine asked Elena to check whether the company appeared elsewhere in the legitimate records. They found more references, not enough to tell the whole story. Enough to show that this wasn't a one-time arrangement. Catherine sat quietly. "Do you think Bernard knows we're looking at this?" Elena shook her head. "I don't know." Catherine looked toward the office door. "I don't want him to know yet." Elena glanced at her. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what we're looking at before I ask him another question." That was different from the woman Catherine had been a month earlier. She wasn't avoiding the question because she was afraid of the answer. She was waiting until she had enough information to ask the right one. But Bernard was beginning to notice the change in her. The questions had become more specific. Catherine no longer accepted. "I'll explain later." Elena checked dates more carefully. And Bernard, who had spent months assuming that the two women in his life knew completely different versions of him, began sensing something he couldn't quite identify. That evening, Elena was finishing some paperwork when Bernard appeared unexpectedly. He leaned against the doorway. "You've been working late. There's a lot to organize." He nodded. Then, almost casually, he asked, "Has Catherine been asking you about my business?" Elena's hand stopped moving. For a moment, she couldn't even think of an answer. Bernard watched her carefully, and Elena suddenly understood that he wasn't asking because he was curious. He was checking whether the wall between the two women had already come down. Elena's hand remained on the keyboard after Bernard asked the question, "Has Catherine been asking you about my business?" She looked up at him. For a second, she considered telling him the truth. Yes. Catherine had been asking questions. They had compared dates, invoices, meeting schedules, and explanations. They had discovered the second company, and they had agreed not to confront Bernard until they understood what they were looking at. But Elena remembered the way Bernard had asked. He wasn't smiling anymore. "No," she said. Bernard studied her face. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Good." He pushed himself away from the doorway. "Because Catherine has been asking some strange questions lately." Elena waited. "She seems convinced there's something wrong with the business. Maybe she's worried. She worries about things she doesn't understand." The sentence sounded familiar. Elena had heard him say similar things about Catherine before. But this time, she noticed something else. Bernard wasn't defending Catherine. He was preparing Elena to distrust her. The next morning, Catherine received her own version. Bernard was making coffee when he casually said, "I need to talk to you about Elena." Catherine looked up. "What about her?" "She made a mistake yesterday." "What kind of mistake?" "She accessed information she wasn't supposed to see." Catherine frowned. "What information?" Bernard shook his head. "I don't want to get into details." "Then how do you know she accessed it?" "I was told." "By whom?" Bernard sighed. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." Catherine stared at him. "What?" "You've become obsessed with checking everything." "I asked one question." "You've been asking a lot of questions." Catherine felt irritation rising. Bernard continued quietly. "I know the affair has hurt you. I understand that. But bringing Elena into the business was a mistake." Catherine froze. "What do you mean?" "You hired her." Catherine said nothing. Bernard's expression changed slightly. "I didn't know why at first. Now I think you're trying to monitor me through her." Catherine's stomach tightened. "That isn't what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" She didn't answer. Bernard looked almost disappointed. "I thought you were trying to move forward." He picked up his coffee and walked away. Catherine remained in the kitchen. For the first time since she hired Elena, a question she hadn't allowed herself to ask entered her mind. What if Bernard was right about her? Not about everything, but what if she had allowed anger to turn into obsession? What if Elena really had been careless with confidential information? Catherine didn't like the thought. She especially didn't like that Bernard had managed to put it there so easily. Later that day, Elena approached her. "I think Bernard is worried about me." Catherine looked up. "What did he say?" Elena hesitated. "He asked whether you've been asking me about his business." Catherine's expression changed. "What did you tell him?" "That I hadn't." "You lied?" Elena's face tightened. "I didn't know what else to say." Catherine leaned back. "You should have told me. I didn't want to make things worse." "You don't get to decide that without telling me." Elena stared at her. "So, now you're angry with me?" "I'm trying to understand what happened." "That sounds a lot like what Bernard said you do." Catherine went silent. The words hurt more than Elena intended. "What did he tell you?" "That you're becoming obsessed with controlling everything." Catherine laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Of course he did." Elena crossed her arms. "And he said you hired me because you wanted to punish me." Catherine looked at her. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know." That answer changed the room. Catherine had expected Elena to defend her. Elena had expected Catherine to reassure her. Neither happened. Instead, suspicion settled between them. Catherine began wondering whether Elena had known more about Bernard's business than she admitted. Perhaps she had seen transactions Catherine hadn't. Perhaps she had been involved in some of them. Elena, meanwhile, began wondering whether Catherine had hired her from the beginning with the intention of destroying her relationship with Bernard. The two women continued working together, but something had changed. Their conversations became shorter. They stopped sharing every observation. They checked each other's work more carefully. Bernard had managed to create distance without directly ordering either woman to distrust the other. He had simply given each of them a story that made suspicion feel reasonable. And for several days, it worked. Then, Elena noticed something that made her uncomfortable. Bernard had given her an instruction about a client meeting. The instructions seemed ordinary, but when she later checked the calendar, the details didn't match. She looked at the message again, then at the schedule. Something wasn't right. She didn't know it yet. But Bernard had stopped merely reacting to their questions. He had begun testing whether he could control what they believed. And this time, he was going to give Elena information that he already knew was false. The instruction arrived on a Wednesday morning. Bernard walked into the office, carrying a thin folder, and placed it on Elena's desk. "I need this handled before Friday." Elena opened the folder. Inside was information about a client meeting scheduled for the following week. Bernard explained that the client had requested a change in the meeting location and asked Elena to update the calendar and notify the people involved. She wrote everything down. "Anything else?" "Oh, that's it." He walked away. Elena watched him leave. The instructions seemed ordinary, but after the tension of the previous week, she had become more careful about everything Bernard told her. She checked the calendar. Then she checked the existing correspondence. The meeting was listed for Friday afternoon. Bernard had told her it was Thursday. She hesitated. Maybe the calendar hadn't been updated. She asked Bernard, "You said Thursday?" "Yes." "The calendar says Friday." "It changed." "When?" "Yesterday." Elena nodded. "Okay." She updated the schedule. The next morning, Bernard asked why the client had been notified about Friday. Elena stared at him. "You told me Friday." "No, I didn't." "You did." Bernard's expression hardened. "Be careful, Elena. I wrote it down. You misunderstood me." "I don't think I did." Bernard picked up the folder. "This is exactly why I was concerned about giving you access to sensitive work." Elena felt her face grow warm. "You gave me the instruction, and you're now telling me I didn't?" She looked at him. "Yes." Bernard shook his head. "I don't have time for this." He walked away. Elena sat at her desk, stunned. For the rest of the morning, she kept replaying the conversation. Had she misunderstood him? She hated that possibility. She checked her notes. The instruction was written clearly. Thursday. She checked the original calendar. Friday. Then she remembered something Catherine had said. Don't assume, verify. Elena didn't confront Bernard again. Instead, she saved the legitimate record of the instruction and continued working. That afternoon, Bernard spoke to Catherine. He's becoming careless, he said. Catherine looked up. Who? Elena. What happened? She made another mistake. Catherine listened. Bernard explained the situation in a way that made Elena sound irresponsible. He didn't mention that his original instruction had been different. He said Elena had changed a meeting without authorization. Catherine felt the old uncertainty return. She didn't want to believe him. But she also didn't want to believe Elena simply because Elena was helping her. Did you speak to her? Yes. And? She blamed me. Catherine looked down. That sounded like Elena. Or at least, it sounded possible. Bernard had become very good at presenting possibilities as facts. Later that evening, Catherine found Elena reviewing the same meeting records. You changed the appointment? Elena looked up. No. Bernard said you did. He told me to. Catherine's expression tightened. Are you sure? Elena stared at her. Yes. Then why does he say otherwise? I don't know. Catherine sat down. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Elena finally said, Maybe he gave me the wrong information. Catherine looked at her. On purpose? I don't know. The answer bothered Catherine because she realized something. They were back where they had started. They were asking what Bernard wanted them to ask. Was Elena careless? Was Catherine controlling? Was Bernard simply caught between two women who didn't trust each other? Every question seemed to lead back to the same uncertainty. That night, Catherine sat alone in the bedroom after Bernard had gone downstairs. She could hear him moving around in the kitchen. She wanted to confront him. She wanted to walk downstairs and put every document on the table. She wanted to ask him why he had lied about Elena, the business, the travel, and the meetings. But then she imagined the conversation. Bernard would ask why she had been investigating him. He would accuse her of invading his privacy. He would ask whether she trusted Elena more than her own husband. And somehow, the conversation would become about Catherine, her anger, her jealousy, her decision to hire Eleanor, her inability to let go. Catherine knew that pattern. She had experienced it before. So she opened her notebook instead. She wrote down the facts. Bernard had given Elena one instruction. The written record reflected another. Bernard had later accused Elena of changing the schedule. Catherine had heard both versions. She didn't write what she believed. She wrote what she knew. That small distinction calmed her. The following morning, she began doing the same thing with every important conversation. Dates, times, exact statements, documents, nothing more. Bernard noticed. He didn't say anything at first, but his behavior toward Catherine became colder. He started telling people she was under emotional strain. He suggested to one acquaintance that the affair had affected her judgment. He told another that she had become unusually suspicious. Catherine eventually heard about it. It hurt. Not because strangers believed him, because she recognized what he was building. If she challenged him publicly, he could point to her anger as proof that she was unstable. If she remained quiet, his version could spread without resistance. For the first time, Catherine understood that Bernard wasn't simply trying to hide the truth. He was preparing people to doubt her if the truth ever came out. She closed her notebook. Then, she wrote one more sentence. Don't give him your reaction. Give him the facts. She didn't know how far Bernard intended to take it. She would find out soon, because within days, Catherine's own name would appear on a record connected to an expense she had never approved. Catherine first noticed the document because the amount was small enough to look ordinary. It was a company expense for a few $1,000s, listed among several other transactions that required review. She wasn't looking for her own name. That was what made seeing it so unsettling. Her name appeared beside an authorization she had never given. Catherine stared at the screen. Then she read it again. Approved by Catherine. Her stomach tightened. Eleanor came over. What is it? Catherine pointed at the record. Elena leaned closer. For several seconds, she didn't speak. I've never seen that before, Elena said. Neither have I. They checked the date. Catherine remembered that week immediately. She had been traveling for work. She had spent 2 nights outside Boston for a company meeting and had returned late on Thursday. The supposed authorization had been dated Wednesday. Catherine opened her calendar. There it was. A full day of meetings. A flight. A hotel reservation. She remembered sitting in a conference room almost 200 miles away. I couldn't have approved this. Elena looked at her. Could someone have used your name? Catherine didn't answer. She looked at the document again. The signature looked convincing. Too convincing. Her first instinct was to call Bernard. She reached for her phone, then stopped. She remembered the notebook. Facts first. She took a screenshot of the record and printed the available documentation. What exactly is this payment for? She asked. Elena checked the description. Business expense. That's all? That's all it says. Catherine sat down. For several minutes, she couldn't think clearly. The affair had hurt. The lies had embarrassed her. But this was different. If her name was attached to financial activity she hadn't authorized, the consequences could reach beyond her marriage, her career, her professional reputation, her financial records, her credibility. All of it could be affected. And Bernard knew exactly how much Catherine valued her reputation. She looked at Elena. Did you know about this? Elena's expression changed. What? Did Bernard ever ask you to process something using my name? No. You're sure? Yes. Catherine looked away. Elena understood what had just happened. You think I might be involved? I don't know what to think. Elena stepped back. After everything we've done together, you're asking me if I helped him? I'm asking because I don't know. That sounds like an accusation. It isn't. It feels like one. Catherine closed her eyes. She knew Elena was right. The uncertainty was turning them against each other again. Elena picked up her bag. Maybe I should leave. Catherine looked at her. Maybe. Elena stared at her for a moment. Then she walked out. The door closed softly behind her. Catherine remained at the desk. She wanted to call Elena back, but fear had replaced anger. For the first time, she wondered whether Bernard had managed to create something much larger than confusion. Maybe Elena knew more than she had admitted. Maybe the second company was connected to the affair. Maybe Bernard had been using Elena to move information between different parts of his life. Catherine spent that evening reviewing her own records. She pulled out old receipts, travel confirmation, work calendars, hotel records, emails. She wasn't looking for Bernard anymore. She was looking for herself. And then she found something. The authorization date was a Wednesday. Catherine had been in Philadelphia that day for a work meeting. Her calendar showed it. Her hotel confirmation showed it. Her flight record showed it. She had not been anywhere near the office. More importantly, she remembered something else. The language in the authorization didn't sound like her. Catherine had a particular way of writing professional instructions. She used short sentences, clear dates, specific action items. The authorization used a phrase she never used. It was small, but Catherine knew her own writing. She returned to the document. The signature looked like hers. The name was hers. The date was real. But the authorization itself didn't belong to her. Her phone rang. It was Eleanor. Catherine answered. Hello. I remembered something. Catherine sat up. What? When Bernard was talking about the business a few months ago, he told me you handled certain financial matters because you were obsessed with details. Catherine frowned. I don't handle company finances. I know that now. Elena paused. But, at the time, I believed him. Catherine looked back at the document. Something clicked. If Bernard wanted to make a transaction appear legitimate, attaching Catherine's name to it would make sense. People who knew her reputation might assume she had approved it. She opened her calendar again. Then, the hotel record. Then, the document. The pieces weren't complete, but they were beginning to point in the same direction. Catherine whispered, He didn't just lie about me. Eleanor was silent. Then she understood. He made it look like you lied about yourself. Catherine looked at the authorization one more time. The signature looked like hers, but the words underneath it didn't. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Bernard had been unfaithful. It was whether he had been preparing a version of the truth in which Catherine would eventually become responsible for things she had never done. The morning after Elena's phone call, Catherine did something she had never done before in her marriage. She stopped trying to remember what Bernard had said. Instead, she started writing down what could be verified. By 8:30, the dining table was covered with papers. A hotel confirmation sat beside a printed calendar. Receipts were stacked in one corner. Emails were open on Catherine's laptop, and Elena had brought over several business records she had legitimately encountered while doing her work. Neither woman spoke much at first. They were tired. They had spent too many weeks trying to understand a man who seemed to change the shape of his story, depending on who was listening. Catherine finally picked up a notebook. We're going to start with dates. Elena nodded. Not explanations? Not yet. Catherine wrote the first date, then the second, then the third. They began with the authorization that carried Catherine's name. The document said Catherine had approved the expense on a Wednesday. Her calendar showed she had been in Philadelphia. Her hotel receipt confirmed the stay. Her company's travel record showed when she had arrived and when she had left. There was no reason to assume the records were connected to Bernard's explanation. They simply established where Catherine had been. Elena placed another document beside it. This is the payment. Catherine looked at the date. Same day. Then Elena added the corresponding business communication. The transaction had been discussed internally after the supposed authorization. Catherine frowned. That's strange. What? The wording. Elena leaned closer. Catherine pointed to the email. This doesn't sound like the authorization. Because you didn't write it? Exactly. Eleanor was quiet. Catherine wasn't claiming that yet as proof of anything. She was learning to separate suspicion from evidence. So they kept going. They checked another expense, then another. A meeting Bernard had described as being in Boston had actually taken place remotely. A hotel expense he had described as a client meeting fell on a night when no corresponding meeting appeared on the calendar. A payment described as a business expense appeared close to a personal financial obligation. Again, none of those things alone established misconduct. But when placed beside each other, they created a timeline. And the timeline was beginning to tell a story Bernard had never told anyone. Elena looked at the growing stack of documents. He couldn't have expected anyone to put all of this together. Catherine looked at her. That's the point. What? He didn't need everyone to believe one huge lie. Catherine turned another page. He only needed each person to know a different piece. The realization settled over them slowly. Bernard had given Catherine enough information to make his business explanations believable. He had given Elena enough information to make his explanation about the marriage believable. He had given employees another version. Clients received another. Investors, family members, and professional contacts each appeared to have their own pieces. None of them had the complete picture. And because the pieces didn't look connected, nobody had a reason to question the entire structure. Catherine sat back. That was why I kept doubting myself. Elena looked at her. Oh, because every explanation sounded reasonable by itself. She looked down at the notebook. If I questioned one thing, he had an answer. She turned the page. If I questioned another, he had another answer. And together? Catherine exhaled. Together, they don't make sense. They continued through the afternoon. Emails, receipts, travel records, calendar entries, invoices, bank documentation that was legitimately available to them, business communications, meeting dates. They did not break into anything. They did not guess passwords. They did not manufacture evidence. They simply compared records that had come into their possession through legitimate means. And the more they compared, the harder it became to dismiss the inconsistencies as coincidence. At one point, Elena stopped and looked at Catherine. You know what scares me? Catherine looked up. What? I don't think he was lying randomly. Catherine's pen stopped. Neither woman spoke for several seconds, because that was the part neither of them wanted to say aloud. Bernard's lies appeared to have structure. He didn't simply invent stories. He used gaps. If someone didn't know where he had been, he supplied a reason. If someone didn't understand a transaction, he supplied a business explanation. If two people had different information, he made sure neither knew enough to compare it. Catherine looked at the notebook. For years, she had thought she was keeping records because she was organized. Now, those ordinary habits were becoming something else, a way to reconstruct reality. She turned to a clean page and wrote a sentence across the top. What did he know each person did not know? Eleanor, read it. That might be the most important question we've asked. Catherine nodded, and for the first time, they stopped looking at Bernard's individual lies. They began looking at the architecture behind them. By the following week, the dining table had become a place Catherine barely recognized. There were folders everywhere. One contained travel records. Another held business invoices. Elena had organized emails by date, while Catherine had created a simple timeline that stretched across several sheets of paper. They weren't looking at Bernard's life anymore as one long story. They were looking at it as a series of events. And that made a difference. The first pattern appeared around the business. Bernard had told Catherine that the company was financially healthy and preparing for expansion. The records showed something more complicated. Several clients had reduced their contracts. A major project had performed poorly. Operating revenue was weaker than Bernard had represented. There were overdue obligations. Money had also moved between business entities in ways that required explanation. Catherine stared at the timeline. He wasn't preparing for expansion. Elena shook her head. Oh. He was trying to keep the company looking stable. That seems to be what the records suggest. Catherine didn't answer immediately. She had to remind herself that suspicion wasn't proof. So they kept verifying. One transaction connected to the second company had a legitimate explanation. Another appeared to relate to a business service, but several payments had vague descriptions, and the documentation surrounding them was incomplete. Some money eventually appeared to cover obligations that didn't look like ordinary operating expenses. Catherine felt a chill. Personal obligations. Eleanor nodded. That seems possible. Catherine looked at the page. So he was using the business to cover problems in his personal life. We need a professional to determine exactly what happened. I know. That distinction mattered. Catherine wasn't going to become an accountant overnight. She wasn't going to declare Bernard guilty based on a spreadsheet. But she could recognize when the explanation she had been given didn't match the records. Then they examined the affair. That part was uncomfortable. Bernard had told Elena that his marriage was essentially over. He had described himself as emotionally separated from Catherine. He had told Elena that certain financial arrangements were the only reason they remained legally married. Catherine had never heard any of that. At home, Bernard had continued discussing vacations, house expenses, family obligations, plans for the future. He had acted like their marriage was imperfect but intact. Elena looked uncomfortable. I believed him. Catherine didn't respond. I know that doesn't make what I did okay, Elena continued. But I believed him. Catherine finally looked at her. I know. That was one of the hardest things Catherine had learned. Elena had made a choice. She had been wrong to participate in an affair with a married man. But Bernard had also deliberately given her information designed to make that choice easier. Both things could be true. Elena had made a mistake. Bernard had manipulated her. Catherine turned another page. The affair had also provided explanations for things that otherwise might have raised questions. Late nights, hotels, unexplained travel, certain restaurant expenses. Bernard could tell Catherine they were business-related. He could tell Elena they were connected to their relationship. Each explanation covered a different part of the same event. The affair hadn't created the financial problems. It had simply become another compartment where information could be hidden. Catherine sat quietly. Then she said, "It wasn't really about the money." Elena looked at her. "What do you mean?" "He didn't control people because he had money." Catherine pointed to the timeline. He controlled people because he controlled information. That was the revelation that changed everything for her. Bernard had always appeared confident. Catherine had admired that confidence. Now she understood it differently. He knew how much information each person had. He knew what they didn't know. And he adjusted his explanation accordingly. To Catherine, he was the businessman protecting their future. To Elena, he was the unhappy husband preparing to leave. To employees, he was the demanding executive dealing with temporary problems. To professional contacts, he was the confident consultant navigating a difficult period. Each version contained pieces of the truth. That was why the lies survived. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. He didn't have to invent an entirely different life. Eleanor nodded. He just rearranged the one he had. Neither woman spoke after that. There was something almost frightening about how ordinary the method was. No elaborate disguise, no dramatic secret identity, just selective information, a missing detail here, a different explanation there, a conversation nobody else heard, a document someone never saw. And whenever two pieces threatened to connect, Bernard supplied another explanation. Catherine looked at the boxes surrounding them. For weeks, she had felt overwhelmed by the number of contradictions. Now she understood why there were so many. They weren't separate problems. They were connected. She reached for her notebook and wrote, "The affair was one compartment. The business was another. The lies connected them." Elena read the sentence. "So what do we do now?" Catherine looked at the documents. "We stopped trying to expose him ourselves." Elena nodded. "And? We get people who understand this better than we do." Catherine had finally accepted something that would have embarrassed her months earlier. She didn't need to know everything. She needed to know what she didn't know. And then she needed to ask the right people. She closed the notebook. "No more revenge." Elena looked at her. "What about accountability?" Catherine held her gaze. "That's different. For the first time, Catherine wasn't thinking about how to make Bernard suffer. She was thinking about how to make sure the truth could stand without her having to fight for it. Catherine made the decision on a Monday morning. She wasn't going to confront Bernard with the entire stack of documents. She wasn't going to send them to his family. She wasn't going to post anything online. And she certainly wasn't going to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them what kind of man she believed he was. She had spent too much time watching Bernard control people with stories. She wasn't going to answer manipulation with another story. Instead, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to an attorney who could advise her about the marriage and her personal financial interests. The second was to a financial professional who could review the business records and determine what the transactions actually meant. Catherine was nervous before both conversations, not because she was afraid of asking for help, because she was finally admitting something she had avoided for years. There were things she didn't understand, and that was okay. During the financial review, Catherine sat across from a professional with several folders between them. She explained what she knew. Then she explained what she didn't know. She was careful with her language. "I don't want you to assume Bernard did anything wrong because I'm angry with him," she said. "I want to know whether these records are consistent with the explanations we've been given." The professional nodded. "That is the right question." Catherine opened the first folder. She went through the timeline. Client reductions, business losses, transfers, the second company, the authorization carrying her name, the travel records showing where she had been, the emails, the calendar entries. Nothing was presented as a conclusion. Everything was presented as a question. That distinction gave Catherine a strange sense of control. Not control over Bernard, control over herself. At one point, the professional stopped at the document containing Catherine's supposed authorization. "Did you sign this?" "Oh. Do you recognize the signature?" "It resembles mine." "But you didn't authorize the transaction?" "No." "Can you document where you were on that date?" Catherine immediately opened the folder. "Yes." She handed over the hotel confirmation, travel record, and calendar entry. The professional studied them. "This is useful." Catherine looked at the documents. Months earlier, she would have been embarrassed to admit that she didn't understand the significance of the records. Now she simply asked, "Why?" "Because you're separating what you believe from what you can establish." That sentence stayed with her. She had spent so much of her life believing that being competent meant having answers. Now she was learning that competence also meant knowing when you needed someone else's expertise. The review continued. Some transactions had ordinary explanations. Others required further examination. The second company needed to be understood. Certain transfers needed supporting documentation. The questionable authorization needed to be traced. There were no instant conclusions. No dramatic declaration. Just careful work. And strangely, Catherine found that reassuring. The truth didn't need to arrive all at once. It could be built carefully, piece by piece. Elena remained involved where appropriate, but their relationship had changed again. They no longer needed to constantly reassure each other. They had learned something more valuable. Verification. If one of them remembered something differently, they checked the record. If one of them suspected something, they labeled it as suspicion. If they didn't know, they said they didn't know. It was almost the opposite of the way Bernard had operated. One evening, Catherine returned home and saw the boxes of documents stacked beside the dining table. She stopped. For months, those boxes had represented everything she had lost. Her marriage, her trust, her sense of security, her belief that she understood the person she had married. She walked over and placed her hand on the top folder. She had once thought the records were evidence of what Bernard had done to her. Now she saw something else. They were evidence of what she had done for herself. She had noticed something wasn't right. She had asked questions. She had preserved records. She had checked her own memory against documents. And when she didn't understand something, she had finally learned to say so. The financial professional called her the next afternoon. "There are still questions that need to be answered," they said. "But you were right to keep the records." Catherine sat quietly. "Thank you." After the call ended, she looked again at the boxes. She thought about the woman she had been when Bernard first started saying, "I'll explain it later." She had been afraid that asking twice would make her look unintelligent. Now she understood how dangerous that fear had been. Not understanding something was never the problem. Refusing to ask because of pride was. Catherine closed the box. She didn't feel victorious. Not yet. She felt steadier. And for the first time since the marriage began falling apart, she wasn't trying to control what Bernard would do next. She was preparing herself to respond to whatever the truth revealed. That was enough. Because truth did not need revenge to become powerful. It only needed to be documented, examined, and allowed to stand on its own. The first sign that Bernard's professional world was changing wasn't a dramatic announcement. It was a meeting that lasted much longer than expected. A few people who had once walked into his office casually now arrived with folders. They asked specific questions. They wanted dates. They wanted supporting documents. They wanted to know why certain transactions had been described differently at different times. Bernard still tried to remain calm. He was good at that. He had spent years building a reputation as the person who knew what to do when things became complicated. But the questions were becoming harder to answer with confidence alone. One morning, a business advisor asked him about the second company. What exactly was its purpose? Bernard gave an explanation. The advisor looked down at the paperwork. Then why doesn't this transaction reflect that? Bernard paused. It was an administrative issue. Which administrative issue? I'd have to check. The advisor nodded. Please do. That was the difference now. Before, Bernard could end a conversation with confidence. Now people were asking him to show them. The same thing was happening elsewhere. Accounting records were being reviewed. Lawyers were asking questions. Business relationships that had once seemed secure began changing. One client decided not to renew. Another requested additional documentation before continuing. People who had trusted Bernard for years began quietly reconsidering that trust. Some still defended him. That part surprised Catherine. A person who had known Bernard for years told her, "I've worked with him a long time. I don't believe he would deliberately do something like that." Catherine didn't argue. She understood. Trust doesn't disappear simply because someone presents an accusation. She had once trusted Bernard that way herself. If anything, she understood the instinct better than most people. The problem was that the documentation wasn't asking anyone to believe Catherine. It was asking them to compare records, and records were harder to persuade. Every time Bernard offered an explanation, someone could place it beside an email, an invoice, a calendar entry, or another document. The contradictions accumulated, not dramatically, quietly, one at a time. That was what eventually made them difficult to dismiss. At home, the consequences were becoming personal too. Bernard's family had questions. Some were angry with Catherine. Others were confused. One conversation ended with someone asking her, "Why didn't you just handle this privately?" Catherine sat silently for a moment. There had been a time when that question would have made her defensive. Now she answered calmly, "I tried to understand what was happening privately." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Bernard's financial pressure also increased. Expenses that had once been easy to cover became harder. Business relationships weakened. The confidence that had allowed him to move comfortably through Boston's professional circles was no longer enough to make every problem disappear. For the first time, Bernard couldn't simply move information from one conversation to another and expect nobody to compare it. People were comparing. And when they did, the same pattern appeared. Different explanations, different dates, different versions of the same event. Catherine watched it happen from a distance. She wasn't celebrating. That surprised her. Months earlier, she had imagined wanting Bernard to lose everything. Now that his professional life was beginning to unravel, she mostly felt tired. She understood something important. Consequences weren't revenge. They were what happened when actions finally became visible. One evening, Elena called her. "Did you hear?" "About what?" Another client ended their contract. Catherine was quiet.
Yes. Eleanor hesitated.
Do you feel bad? Catherine thought about it.
I feel sad. For him.
For all of us. Elena didn't answer. Catherine continued. I wish none of this had happened. That was the truth. She wished she had never needed the records. She wished Elena had never met Bernard. She wished Bernard had simply told the truth when the first difficult conversation came. But wishing the past had been different couldn't change what had happened. The records were already there. The questions had already been asked. And Bernard was finally facing something he had spent years avoiding. Not Catherine, not Elena, not even the affair. The consequences of allowing different people to build their lives around different versions of reality. And this time, he couldn't control which version they believed. Because they had begun comparing the records for themselves. Bernard's last attempt to regain control over Catherine came on an ordinary Thursday evening. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. They were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where Catherine had once helped him review business plans. Now there was nothing between them except 2 cups of coffee and several years of things neither of them could take back. Bernard looked exhausted. For the first time, Catherine could see the strain on his face. You destroyed my life, he said. Catherine didn't answer immediately. Bernard looked at her. If you had just come to me privately, we could have handled this. Catherine almost smiled, not because it was funny, because the sentence sounded so familiar. He had found another way to make the consequences about her. You mean if I had asked you privately, you would have told me the truth? Bernard looked away. I could have explained everything. You had months. I was trying to protect us. From what? He didn't answer. Catherine waited. Bernard finally said, You didn't have to involve other people. I didn't. You hired Elena.
Yes.
You brought her into our lives. Catherine looked at him. You brought her into our marriage. Bernard's jaw tightened. That isn't fair. Catherine remained calm. I didn't create the affair. You could have confronted me. I did ask questions. You were suspicious.
Yes.
You stopped trusting me. Catherine looked down at the table.
Oh, Bernard.
She lifted her eyes. I stopped accepting explanations without checking them.
He stared at her.
There was a difference, and for once, Catherine didn't need him to understand it. Bernard leaned back. You humiliated me. I didn't need to. What does that mean? Your actions were already there. He looked frustrated. You think you're innocent in all of this?
No.
That answer surprised him. Catherine continued. I stayed quiet when I should have asked questions. I was afraid of looking foolish. I trusted you when the evidence was telling me to slow down and verify things. Those were my mistakes. Bernard said nothing. But your choices were yours. The room became quiet. Catherine realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for without knowing it. Not the moment Bernard admitted everything. Not the moment he apologized. The moment she stopped needing either one. Bernard looked at her. Do you really think our marriage meant nothing? Catherine felt something inside her soften.
No.
It was the most honest answer she could give. Our marriage meant something to me. Then why are you doing this? Because something can matter and still end. Bernard looked down. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Their marriage had not ended because one conversation suddenly revealed that everything had been fake. There had been real affection, real memories, real ordinary mornings, real holidays, real plans. That was part of what made the betrayal painful. Catherine wasn't throwing away a completely empty relationship. She was accepting that the relationship she had loved could no longer continue as it had. The legal process that followed was not dramatic. It was paperwork, meetings,
Questions,
financial reviews, difficult decisions about property and accounts. There were moments when Catherine felt exhausted by the practical details, but she kept reminding herself that leaving a marriage was not the same thing as erasing its history. She could acknowledge what had been good without pretending the ending was acceptable. Elena had her own reckoning. One evening, she sat with Catherine and finally said what she had avoided.
I was wrong.
Catherine looked at her. I knew Bernard was married.
Yes.
I believed him when he said the marriage was over. Catherine waited. But I wanted to believe him. That was the part Elena needed to say. She hadn't been completely helpless. She had ignored warning signs because Bernard's explanation was convenient. She had accepted a relationship that should have raised harder questions. Catherine didn't excuse her, but she didn't condemn her either. You have to live with that, Catherine said. I know, and learn from it. I will.
Elena nodded.
I don't want to become the kind of person who only admits a mistake when someone else proves it. Catherine understood that, because she had been learning a similar lesson herself. They both had to accept responsibility for the parts that belonged to them. Bernard had made his choices.
Elena had made hers.
Catherine had made hers. Nobody could rewrite that. But they could decide what those choices would mean for the rest of their lives. When the marriage was finally ending, Bernard asked Catherine one last time to reconsider. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't hate you, she said. He seemed almost surprised. I just don't trust you anymore. And Catherine finally understood that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. She could let go of the need to punish Bernard. She could wish him a better person than he had been. But she didn't have to give him another opportunity to control her life. The marriage was over. And for the first time, Catherine wasn't asking herself how she could save it. She was asking herself what kind of life she wanted to build after it. Months passed before Catherine stopped expecting another problem. At first, every unfamiliar email made her tense. Every unexpected phone call made her wonder whether another document had surfaced. She kept the boxes of records in a closet, carefully labeled and organized. Then one Saturday morning, she opened the closet and looked at them. She almost laughed. There had been a time when those boxes represented fear. Now they simply looked like cardboard boxes. Life had moved forward. Catherine had rebuilt the parts of her finances that Bernard had once managed. She had reviewed accounts more carefully. She asked questions. Sometimes she asked the same question twice. And if someone used technical language she didn't understand, she no longer nodded politely just to avoid looking uninformed. One afternoon, during a professional meeting, someone explained a complicated financial issue to her. Catherine listened. Then she said, I understand the general idea, but I don't understand how that number was calculated. The room went quiet for a moment. The person explained it again. Catherine asked another question, and another. Nobody laughed. Nobody thought she was unintelligent. They simply answered. Catherine realized how much of her old fear had been unnecessary. Not knowing something wasn't weakness. Pretending to understand was. Elena's life changed too. She completed the project management certification she had once hoped Bernard would help her pursue. She paid for it herself. The first time she received her certification, she sent Catherine a photograph. Catherine smiled when she saw it. You did it. Elena replied, I did. There was no mention of Bernard. That mattered. Elena's career was no longer connected to him. Neither woman's future depended on the man who had once seemed capable of controlling both their lives. Several months later, Catherine was having coffee with a woman she knew through work. The woman looked tired. She kept stirring her coffee, even though there was no sugar left to dissolve. There is something strange about him, she said. Catherine listened. He tells me one thing about his finances, then something different about his work. And when I ask questions, he says I'm being insecure. Catherine didn't immediately tell her what to do. She remembered how badly she had once wanted someone to tell her the answer. Instead, she asked, What do you actually know? The woman looked confused. What do you mean? What have you personally verified? The woman thought about it. Not much. Catherine nodded. Then start there. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She handed it across the table. Write down what he says. Write down dates. Keep documents you're legitimately entitled to have. Separate what you know from what you've been told. The woman looked at her. Are you telling me to leave him?
No.
Then what are you telling me? Catherine smiled gently. I'm telling you to make sure you're making decisions based on reality. The woman took the notebook. Weeks later, she called Catherine. I figured it out. Catherine listened. He kept changing the story. What are you going to do? I ended it. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't told the woman to leave. She hadn't needed to. The woman had recognized the pattern herself. After the call, Catherine sat quietly. She thought about the boxes in her closet. At the beginning, she had believed the records were about Bernard. Then she believed they were about proving what he had done. Now she understood something different. They were about her. They were proof that her observations had been worth listening to. She had noticed the second phone, the locked drawer, the late-night messages, the unexplained travel, the contradictions. Her mistake hadn't been noticing. Her mistake had been believing that noticing something wasn't enough to justify asking questions. Bernard had benefited from that hesitation, but he couldn't benefit from it anymore. He had believed that whoever controlled information controlled the story. He had been wrong. The truth didn't need Catherine to scream. It didn't need Elena to take revenge. It didn't need either woman to destroy him. It only needed to remain consistent long enough for the lies to contradict themselves. Catherine opened one of the old boxes. The papers were still there. Invoices, receipts, travel records, emails,
Calendar entries.
She touched the top page and smiled faintly. The records had started as protection. They had become proof. But eventually, they became something else. Freedom. Because Catherine no longer needed another person's confidence to tell her whether she was allowed to trust what she had seen. She understood that healthy trust could survive questions. Real trust did not require silence. And when someone repeatedly demanded that you ignore contradictions, discouraged you from verifying important facts, or made you feel foolish for asking reasonable questions, the problem might not be that you were incapable of trusting. Sometimes the problem was that someone needed you not to question them. Catherine closed the box. She didn't need to hate Bernard. She didn't need to keep reliving what he had done. She simply needed to remember what she had learned. Being intelligent did not mean understanding everything immediately. Being strong did not mean never needing help. And trusting someone did not mean surrendering your right to ask questions. For years, Catherine had believed the records were documenting Bernard's lies. In the end, they documented something far more important. They documented the moment she stopped doubting herself. If Catherine's story made you look differently at trust, honesty, or the questions we sometimes silence just to keep a relationship peaceful, take a moment and think about this. Have you ever ignored something that didn't feel right because you were afraid of what asking the question might reveal? Sometimes asking questions doesn't destroy trust. Sometimes it reveals whether trust was ever being respected in the first place. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need to hear that lesson today. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Daily Comfort Stories and become part of our family. Tell us in the comments, what was the biggest lesson Catherine learned from Bernard? Thank you for spending your time with us. Until our next story, remember, you don't have to know everything immediately, but you should never be afraid to ask.